there is a photograph taken from space that most people have never seen. It was captured by a radar instrument flown aboard the space shuttle, looking straight down at North Africa. And at first glance, it looks like what you would expect. Brown, pale orange, where the light hits the dunes at a low angle. The Sahara Desert, the largest hot desert on Earth, filling the frame from edge to edge like a wound in the surface of the planet. But look closer. Beneath the sand, visible only because the radar signal passed through the surface layer and bounced back from something harder underneath. There are lines, long, branching, unmistakable lines running for hundreds of miles across the desert floor. Lines that do not belong to any river that exists today. Lines that do not appear on any map of the modern world. They are the ghosts of rivers. Not small rivers. River systems wide enough and old enough to have carved valleys into the bedrock beneath the sand. Rivers that once carried enough water to support fish and crocodiles, and the kind of dense vegetation that only grows where rain is reliable and the ground stays wet between seasons. Those rivers are gone. The water is gone. The green is gone. What remains is the shape of them, pressed into the rock beneath a desert that has spent thousands of years trying to erase every trace of what was here before. It has not entirely succeeded. Because scattered across the Sahara, if you know where to look, the evidence keeps surfacing. Fossil bones of hippopotamuses in the middle of Libya, shells of freshwater snails in the sand dunes of Algeria, the pollen of tropical trees, preserved in lake sediment, cores drilled from the floor of what is now one of the driest places on Earth, and on the walls of sandstone cliffs in a place called Tassili Naja, in the heart of the Algerian Sahara. Thousands of images carved and painted by human hands, images of cattle, of girafes, of people swimming, of crocodiles in rivers that no longer exist. Someone stood in this desert and watched a crocodile move through the water, and they thought it was worth remembering. That is the thing that stops you. When you sit with it long enough, not the science, not the climate mechanism or the orbital cycle or the rainfall data. The fact that a human being stood in a place that is now one of the most hostile environments on Earth and looked at the world around them and decided it was worth recording, worth pressing into stone, worth leaving behind for whoever came after. They could not have known that what came after would be a desert. They could not have known that the world they were recording would become, within a few thousand years, almost completely unrecognizable. They were just doing what people do when they live somewhere long enough to love it. They were leaving a mark. And 10,000 years later, in a landscape that looks nothing like what they saw, the marks are still there. This is a story about a world that no longer exists, about the people who lived in it, who built their lives inside it, who buried their dead beside its lakes and painted its animals on its walls, about the slow and irreversible process by which that world disappeared, and about what happened to the people who were standing in it when it did. It is not a story about ancient climate, or not only that. It is a story about what it means to call a place home, and what it costs when home disappears. The Sahara is not supposed to need an introduction. Everyone knows what it is. The word itself carries the image with it. Sand, heat, emptiness. The kind of landscape that appears in movies as the background for exhaustion and desperation, where the horizon offers nothing and the sun is not a comfort but a threat. 9.2 million square kilometers of it, larger than the continental United States, stretching from the Atlantic coast of Mauritania all the way to the Red Sea, from the Mediterranean shore of Libya down into the heart of the continent. When people think of Africa, this is often the first image. not the forests of the Congo Basin, not the grasslands of the Serengeti, the Sahara, the great empty quarter, the place where the continent seems to give up on being alive. And the strange thing is, that image is not wrong. The Sahara today is exactly as harsh as people imagine it to be. Surface temperatures on the desert floor can reach 80 degrees Celsius on the hottest days. In the driest parts, years can pass with almost no measurable rain. Some weather stations in the central Sahara have gone long stretches without recording a meaningful drop. The wind moves sand dunes the way water moves waves, constantly reshaping the surface of the desert in patterns that no fixed map can capture for long. This is a real place. The harshness is not exaggerated. But here is what the image gets wrong. It treats the Sahara as if it were a permanent feature of the planet, as if the desert was simply there, the way mountains are there, the way oceans are there, fixed, inevitable, a geological fact that predates human history and will outlast it. It is not. The Sahara has not always been a desert, not in the deep past, not in the distant geological record of a younger Earth, but recently, in human terms, recently, within the span of time that our species has been fully modern, fully capable of language and memory and art and burial, the Sahara has been something else entirely. It has been alive, not alive, in the way that deserts are sometimes described as alive, the way people say even the Sahara has its lizards and its beetles and its sparse adapted plants. Alive in the way that the Serengeti is alive. Alive with lakes and rivers and grasslands and forests along the water's edge. Alive with the kinds of animals that require reliable rainfall and permanent water to survive. Alive with people who did not pass through it cautiously. The way a traveler crosses hostile territory, but who stayed, who built, who raised children and buried parents, and learned the rhythms of a landscape that sustained them across generations. This is not mythology. It is not the kind of ancient legend that gets passed down until it becomes impossible to separate fact from embellishment. It is science. It is written in the sediment cores, and the fossil beds, and the lake deposits, and the pollen records, and the bones, and the art that the people of the Green Sahara left behind. And it raises a question that is simple to ask and genuinely difficult to sit with. If the world's greatest desert was once a living world, what does that mean for how we understand the desert that is there now? What does it mean for the people who lived through the transformation? What does it mean to look at 9 million square kilometers of sand and understand that somewhere beneath it, underneath the dunes and the heat and the blowing mineral dust, there is a memory of something that was completely, unrecognizably different? The Sahara, we know, is not the original. It is not the permanent version. It is one chapter in a much longer story. And the chapter before, it was so different that a person standing in the middle of the modern desert and a person standing in the same location 8,000 years ago would have been looking at what might as well have been 2 different planets. This is where the story begins. Not with the desert, with the world that existed before the desert, with the understanding that what we see when we look at the Sahara is not what has always been there, but what remains after something extraordinary ended. The wall was not always a wall. For a long time, it was a door, and for the people who lived on the other side of that door, before it closed, this was not the edge of the world. It was the center of it. In the year 2000, a paleontologist named Paul Sereno was lost. Not lost in the way that people get lost in cities, where lost means inconvenient and fixable within minutes. Lost in the Tenere, which is a different category of lost entirely. The Tenere is the desert within a desert. The part of the Sahara that the Tuareg people, who have been crossing the Sahara for centuries, consider the most unforgiving of all its regions. It is a place where the absence of landmarks is so complete that experienced desert travelers have died within miles of where they needed to be. Sereno and his team were not looking for what they found. They were looking for dinosaur bones, which is a reasonable thing to look for in the Tenere because the region is rich in Cretaceous fossil beds, and Sereno had spent years building a career on the Sahara's deep, prehistoric past. But on this particular day, moving across a pale expanse of dried lake bed, one of his team members stopped. Bones in the sand. Not dinosaur bones. Human bones. Sereno would later describe the moment of recognition as arriving slowly. The way understanding sometimes comes when what you are seeing is too large or too strange for the mind to process all at once. More bones. Then more. Then the outline of graves. The deliberate arrangement that distinguishes burial from accident. Then the scale of it, spreading across the dried lake bed in numbers that had no precedent in his experience of this landscape. He was standing in a cemetery. He did not yet know how old it was. He did not yet know that he was standing in one of the most significant prehistoric burial sites ever identified in the Sahara. He did not yet know that the lake whose bed he was crossing had been full of water when the people buried here were alive, or that those people had come back to this specific place to bury their dead across a gap of 1,000 years. Drawn by something that the drying of the world around them had not been able to erase, he only knew that someone had been here, many someones, across many generations, and that the desert had been keeping them. What Sereno's team would eventually document at the site called Gobero was approximately 200 human burials, representing one of the most significant prehistoric cemetery complexes ever identified in the Sahara. People had been coming to this place to bury their dead across multiple periods, separated by centuries, drawn back again and again to the same ground beside what had once been a lake. The lake was gone. It had been gone for thousands of years. But the graves remained, across multiple field seasons, carefully excavating what the desert had preserved. The team found 2 main periods of burial, separated by a gap of roughly 1,000 years. The earlier burials dated to approximately 9,500 years ago, the later ones to somewhere between 4,500 and 5,000 years ago. Between those 2 periods, the evidence suggested the lake had dried up and the people had left. And then, when the water returned, people came back. And when they died, they were buried in the same ground where their predecessors had been buried, in a place that had apparently been held in memory across the gap of an entire millennium. That is the first thing to understand about the people of the Green Sahara. They were not passing through. This was not a waypoint on a longer journey. They had relationships with specific places. They returned to them. They remembered them. They marked them with the weight of their dead. But it is one burial in particular that tends to stop people who encounter Gobero for the first time. In the sediment of the older burial layer, archaeologists found the remains of a woman and 2 children. The woman was an adult. One child was approximately 8 years old. The other was younger, perhaps 5 or 6. They had been buried together, their bodies arranged so that the children faced the woman, their arms reaching toward each other, hands nearly touching. Across all 3 of them, preserved in the chemistry of the sediment after thousands of years, was the trace of flowers. Someone had gathered flowers and placed them over the bodies before the grave was closed. We do not know who she was. We do not know what the children were to her. Whether they were her own, or whether that category even captures what they were to each other, in the way her community understood such things. We do not know what killed them. Whether they died together, or whether their deaths were separated by days or weeks. Whether the flowers were chosen for their color or their scent, or some meaning that has no equivalent in any language still spoken. What we know is this. Someone who was still alive stood over these three people and decided that flowers were the right thing, that the weight of what had happened required something more than just earth, that these three, this woman and these two children, deserved to go into the ground with something beautiful placed over them. That impulse is not foreign to us. It is, in fact, one of the most recognizable things in the entire story we are telling. It did matter. It still does. So, what was that world? Begin with water. Because water is where everything else begins. The lake at Gobero was not unique. It was one node in a system of lakes and wetlands and seasonal rivers that extended across what is now the central and western Sahara, fed by a monsoon system that reached far further north than it does today, Lake Mega-Chad, in what is now the Chad Basin, was, at its peak extent, something almost impossible to picture from the vantage point of the present. It covered an area of roughly 400,000 square kilometers, about the size of California. For comparison, the modern Lake Chad covers somewhere between 1,000 and 17,000 square kilometers, depending on the season. Mega Chad was not a bigger version of Lake Chad. It was a different category of thing entirely. An inland sea, sitting in the middle of a continent, visible from space in a way that the modern lake is not. And Mega Chad was not alone. Across what is now Libya and Algeria and Mali and Mauritania, paleo lakes dotted the landscape. Not all of them were present at the same time, and not all of them were permanent. Some were seasonal, some grew and shrank with the rhythm of annual rainfall. But taken together, they formed a network of wet places in a landscape that today offers almost none. A network that animals could move through, that people could live in. That made the interior of North Africa not a barrier, but a terrain. The animals that lived in this terrain were not desert animals. They were savanna animals, grassland animals, animals that require reliable water and vegetation that only grows where rain is consistent. There were hippopotamuses in the lakes of what is now the Fezzan region of Libya. There were crocodiles in rivers that crossed what is now the central Algerian Sahara. There were elephants and giraffes and multiple species of antelope in regions where today even the hardiest desert grasses struggle to survive. We know this not from inference, but from bones, from teeth, from the kind of direct physical evidence that leaves little room for doubt about the broad picture, and we know it from the walls. Tassili Najer is a plateau in the Algerian Sahara, a landscape of eroded sandstone towers and rock shelters that looks, in photographs, like something from another planet. Across the walls of those rock shelters, spread across an area large enough to qualify as an open-air museum, there are more than 15,000 images carved into the stone, painted with ochre and charcoal and pigments that have survived thousands of years of Saharan wind and temperature. The images are a record, not a single record, not from one period or one community, but a layered archive of multiple eras of human presence in this landscape, each era painted over or around the ones before it, creating a visual stratigraphy that archaeologists have spent decades trying to read. In the oldest layers, there are animals that no longer exist anywhere near this place. Hippopotamuses, crocodiles, cattle in numbers that suggest not wild herds, but managed ones. The beginning of pastoralism. of a relationship between humans and animals that would eventually reshape entire continents. There are human figures running and swimming and dancing and herding and doing the 10,000 things that people do when they are living in a place rather than passing through it. Someone stood in these rock shelters and looked at the world outside and decided it was worth recording. Not because they were making a historical document, not because they understood that this world would one day be gone, and they wanted to leave evidence for the people who came after. People do not think that way. They record what is around them, because it is around them, because it is real and present and worthy of being marked. The hippopotamuses were real. The crocodiles were real. The cattle and the rivers and the lakes and the people swimming in them were real. And the person who pressed pigment into the sandstone wall to record them had no way of knowing that they were painting a world that was already in the slow arithmetic of climate, beginning to end. To understand how the Sahara became green, you have to start somewhere that seems completely unrelated to sand or rain or African grasslands. You have to start with the way the Earth moves. Not its daily rotation. Not the familiar spin that brings the sun up in the morning and takes it down in the evening. Something slower and stranger than that. A wobble. A long, patient wobble in the orientation of Earth's axis. Cycling over a period of roughly 26,000 years. So slow that no human lifetime, no recorded civilization, no dynasty or empire has ever been long enough to notice it directly. But it changes everything. The wobble shifts the angle at which sunlight strikes different parts of the planet during different seasons. And around 11,000 years ago, the geometry of that wobble had reached a configuration that did something specific to the northern hemisphere. It increased the amount of solar radiation reaching North Africa during summer. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have felt sudden or violent to anyone living through it. Just more. More heat arriving at the surface of the land during the months when heat drives the weather systems that determine where rain falls. And where rain falls is not a fixed thing. The rain that waters the Sahel today, the narrow band of grassland that runs across Africa just south of the modern Sahara, is carried by a system of winds and pressure gradients that meteorologists call the West African monsoon. Every year, as the land heats up in summer, it draws moist air in from the Atlantic. That moist air rises, cools, and releases its water as rain. The line where the rain falls and where it stops shifts north and south with the season. In the world we live in, that line stops well short of the central Sahara. The monsoon reaches the Sahel and fades. The interior of North Africa stays dry. But 11,000 years ago, with more solar energy arriving at the northern hemisphere during summer, the land heated more intensely. The pressure gradient between the hot land and the cooler ocean grew steeper. The monsoon was pulled further north. Not a little further. Hundreds of kilometers further. Deep into what is now the central Sahara. Into regions that today receive almost no rainfall at all. Rain fell where rain does not fall now. And this is where something remarkable happened. Something that climate scientists call a feedback loop. And that is one of those technical phrases that sounds dry until you understand what it actually means. When rain fell on the Sahara, plants grew, not immediately, not all at once, but over years and decades and centuries. As rainfall became more reliable, vegetation established itself. Grasses first, then shrubs, then trees along the watercourses. And as vegetation covered the ground changed. Bare sand reflects sunlight. It sends the energy of the sun back into the atmosphere without absorbing it. But plants absorb sunlight. They hold moisture. The vegetation was amplifying the conditions that allowed it to exist, adding moisture back into the local atmosphere in ways that reinforced the rainfall that had produced it. The Sahara was not just receiving more rain from the monsoon. It was helping to sustain that rain. The green world was, in a very literal sense, participating in its own creation. This is what made the Green Sahara so complete, so fully realized as a living system rather than just a slightly less dry version of the desert. It was not merely a place where more rain fell. It was a place that had crossed a threshold, that had built enough biological infrastructure to sustain itself, to create local feedbacks that kept the system running even in years when the monsoon alone might not have been enough. The lake at Gobero filled not just because of orbital mechanics, it filled because of orbital mechanics, plus a landscape that had learned over generations of rainfall how to hold water, how to feed it back into the air, how to keep the cycle turning. And the people who buried their dead beside that lake, who painted the animals on the walls of Tassili, who herded their cattle across grasslands that stretched from the Atlantic to the Nile, were not living in a fragile or temporary world. They were living in a world that had reached a kind of equilibrium, a world that felt, to anyone inside it, like it had always been there and would always be there. That feeling was not unreasonable. For the people of the Green Sahara, the world they knew had been there for longer than their memory extended. Their parents had known it. Their grandparents had known it. The stories their community told about the land around them were stories about this land, this grass, this water, these animals. There is a concept in ecology called the shifting baseline. It describes the tendency of each generation to accept the world it inherits as the normal world, the world as it should be, the reference point against which change is measured. If you grow up beside a lake, the lake is normal. If your children grow up beside a smaller lake, that smaller lake becomes their normal. The loss is real, but it is not felt as loss because the baseline has shifted. The people of the Green Sahara had a baseline that included hippopotamuses and permanent lakes and grasslands reaching to the horizon. They could not have known that this baseline was built on something that was already, imperceptibly, beginning to change. The wobble that had brought the rains north was continuing to wobble. That is the nature of orbital cycles. They do not stop at their peak and hold. They move through the peak and begin the slow return. The solar radiation arriving at North Africa during summer began, after around 9,000 years ago, to decrease, slowly, fractions of a percent per century. Nothing that any person or any generation would notice. But the monsoon notices. The monsoon is sensitive to exactly the kind of forcing that orbital cycles provide. As the summer heat decreased, the pressure gradient weakened. The pull of moist air from the ocean became less powerful. The monsoon began, almost imperceptibly at first, to retreat, and the same feedback that had amplified the greening would eventually amplify the drying. That is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with. The mechanism that built the Green Sahara was not a stable gift. It was a temporary alignment of forces, each one compounding the others, that would eventually compound in the other direction just as powerfully. The door opened because the conditions were right for it to open. The same conditions, running in reverse, would close it. And when it closed, it would not close gently. There is a woman buried in the sand of the Tenere Desert who has been there for thousands of years. We do not know her name. We do not know the language she spoke, or what she called the lake beside which she lived, or what word her people used for the particular shade of green that the grass turned in the weeks after the rains came. We do not know what she believed happened to a person after they died, or whether the flowers placed over her body carried a specific meaning in the tradition of her community, or whether the person who placed them chose them for their color or their scent, or simply because they were the most alive thing within reach at a moment when life had just ended. We know she was here. We know someone loved her enough to make the moment of her burial as worthy as they could of what it contained. And we know that the world she lived in was so completely different from the world that exists in that place today that if you could stand in both simultaneously, you would not recognize them as the same location. That gap between what was there and what is there now is what this chapter is about. Not the climate mechanism, not the orbital cycle, the people, the specific, irreducible, impossible to fully recover people who built their lives in the Green Sahara and left behind just enough evidence for us to understand, in the most fragmentary way, that they were there. Start with the walls again, because the walls are where they speak most clearly. Tassili, Najer is not one site. It is a landscape. A sandstone plateau, roughly 100,000 square kilometers in area, larger than the entire state of Kentucky, carved by ancient water into a maze of canyons and towers and sheltered alcoves that the people of the Green Sahara used the way people use architecture, for shelter, for gathering, for the particular kind of privacy that a rock overhang provides when the wind is up and the rain is coming. And on the walls of those shelters, they painted. The earliest images at Tassili date to the period archaeologists call the round head phase, named for the distinctive style of the human figures. Large, circular heads with no facial features, bodies in motion, arms and legs expressing energy rather than anatomy. These figures are among the most ancient human images in the Sahara. Some of them potentially 12,000 years old, pushing back into the earliest period of the Green Sahara, when the monsoon was first establishing its northern reach, and the lakes were just beginning to fill. We do not know what these images meant to the people who made them. That is an honest statement, and it matters. The temptation, when looking at ancient art, is to project meaning onto it, to reach for the interpretation that feels most resonant from our own vantage point and treat it as though the people who made the art would recognize our reading of it. They might not. The round-head figures may have been sacred or secular, narrative or abstract, the work of specialists or something every person in the community participated in. We do not know. What we know is that they were made with care, with deliberate choice of color and composition, with attention to the bodies they depicted and the space those bodies occupied on the wall. These were not idle marks. They were statements of some kind, addressed to some audience, made by people who understood that the marks would remain after the moment of making had passed. After the round-head phase comes the pastoral phase, and here the images become more immediately legible to a modern eye. Cattle, enormous herds of cattle, painted with an attention to individual animals that suggests these were not generic representations of livestock, but portraits of specific beasts, recognized and valued as individuals. Some of the cattle are shown with elaborate markings. Some have decorative elements on their horns. These are animals that people knew, animals they had relationships with. The presence of cattle in the Green Sahara is significant beyond the art. Cattle require water, not occasionally, not in small amounts, but reliably and regularly. A herd of cattle cannot survive in a landscape that does not offer permanent water sources at intervals close enough to walk between. The cattle paintings at Tassili are not just images. They are evidence. Evidence that the landscape could support large herds of domesticated animals, which means it could support the people who depended on those animals, which means it was a functioning pastoral ecosystem with the kind of productivity that sustains complex human communities across generations. The people who kept these cattle were not nomads in the sense of people without attachment to place. They moved. Yes, following the rhythms of seasonal water and seasonal grass. But movement and rootlessness are not the same thing. The repeated use of specific rock shelters, the accumulation of images across centuries at the same sites, the evidence of Gobero, where people returned to bury their dead in the same ground across a gap of 1,000 years. All of this points to a relationship with the landscape that was intimate and particular. These people knew specific places. They had names for them. They had histories there. And they had each other. This is the part that is easiest to overlook when the evidence is bones and pigment and pollen data. The social world. The fact that behind every grave at Gobero, there was a community that dug it. Behind every image at Tassili, there was a tradition that taught the painter what to paint and how. Behind every cattle herd, there was a system of knowledge about water sources and grazing routes and seasonal patterns, accumulated over generations and transmitted to children who would one day transmit it to their own children. This knowledge was not written down. There was no writing. But the absence of writing does not mean the absence of complexity. The knowledge required to manage cattle herds across a landscape as varied as the Green Sahara, to know which waterholes were reliable in a dry year and which were seasonal, to navigate the social relationships between neighboring communities that competed for the same resources, to maintain the ritual practices that gave the landscape meaning and held the community together through loss and scarcity. This knowledge was sophisticated. It was a curriculum. It was the accumulated intelligence of people who had been paying close attention to a specific place for a very long time. Go back to Gobero one more time. The site contains two distinct burial populations. The earlier group, the Kifian, were tall people. Some of the skeletal remains suggesting heights that would not look unusual in a modern population. They were hunters and fishermen, living beside a lake rich enough to support that kind of subsistence without agriculture or animal husbandry. The bones of fish are found throughout the site. The bones of large animals too. These were people who ate well, which means they lived in a place that provided generously. The later group, the Tenarian, were smaller, and they were pastoralists. They had cattle. The gap between the two periods of burial at Gobero corresponds to a dry interval, a temporary retreat of the monsoon that caused the lake to shrink and eventually disappear, driving the Kifian people away. When the rains returned and the lake refilled, a different people came, different in their physical characteristics, different in their way of life, but drawn to the same place, driven, perhaps, by the same qualities that had drawn the people before them. Water, grass, the particular shelter of a lakeshore in a landscape where such things were precious. And then there is the triple burial. The woman and the two children were part of one of Gobero's earlier burial populations. They died together, or close enough in time that whoever buried them made the decision to put them in the ground as a group. The older child, approximately 8 years old. The younger one, 5 or 6. The woman between them, her arms positioned toward them, their arms reaching back. Someone arranged those arms after the bodies were placed in the ground, after whatever ceremony or silence or weeping accompanied the moment. Someone reached down and positioned the limbs of the dead so that they faced each other, so that the children reached toward the woman and the woman reached toward the children. And then someone placed flowers. There is a finding in the sediment analysis of that grave that is easy to state and hard to absorb. The pollen of flowers was found in the burial fill, not pollen that drifted in from the surrounding landscape. not the ambient pollen that settles everywhere in an environment with blooming plants, but a concentration consistent with fresh flowers being placed directly on or around the bodies before the grave was closed. Someone cut flowers, carried them to the grave, laid them over the dead. We do not know what kind of flowers they were. We do not know if they were chosen for their appearance or their fragrance or their association with something in the belief system of the people who placed them. We do not know if this was a standard practice in their community or something specific to this burial, something called for by the particular weight of losing a woman and 2 children at the same time. We only know that it happened, that a human being, standing in a landscape that is now one of the most desolate places on earth, in a world full enough of life to produce flowers worth cutting, made the decision that these 3 deserved to go into the ground with beauty placed over them. It did matter. It still does. Now consider what science has recently added to this picture. Carefully and with appropriate caution. In the years since Gobero was first excavated, researchers have begun applying ancient DNA analysis to skeletal remains from various Green Sahara sites. The results are preliminary. The sample sizes are small. The data is recent enough that the scientific community is still working through what it means and how confident we can be in the conclusions. But what has emerged from a study published in 2025, analyzing genetic material from individuals buried at a site called Takarkori in southwestern Libya, approximately 7,000 years ago, is something worth noting. Based on a very small sample, their ancestry did not map cleanly onto any single modern population. Their genetic profile pointed to a deeply rooted North African lineage that complicates any simple story about who the people of the Green Sahara were or where they eventually went. The sample is too small to generalize, but it suggests that the Green Sahara was home to people with their own distinct history, not simply a transit zone between populations we already know. They were not visitors. They were home. Go back to the cattle. Not the cattle in the paintings at Tassili, though we will return to them. The actual cattle, the living animals that a family somewhere in what is now central Libya was responsible for, that they had names for, that they had moved across this landscape for generations, following the rhythms of seasonal water and seasonal grass. Those cattle needed to drink every day, which meant the family that kept them needed to know, in detail and in advance, where the water was, not just the water they could see from where they were standing, the water that would be there in 3 days, in a week, at the end of the dry season, when the nearest lake was at its lowest, and the next source was a distance that required planning. That knowledge did not come from one generation. It came from many, from grandparents who had learned it from their grandparents, from communities that traded information the way they traded pottery and stone, because information about water sources in a variable landscape was exactly as valuable as any physical object. And that information moved. It moved between communities that were in contact with each other, that maintained the relationships required to make the exchange worthwhile. A family in what is now Niger knew something about water sources to their east because someone from a community to their east had told them, or because intermarriage had brought that knowledge into their family, or because the network of connections that the Green Sahara made possible extended far enough that knowledge could travel distances no single person would walk in a lifetime. Now look at a map of Africa. Not a political map. Not the kind divided into countries with their borders drawn by people who were mostly not African. A physical map. The kind that shows terrain and elevation and the distribution of ecosystems across the continent. What you see, if you look at it honestly, is a continent divided in the south and center, forest and savanna, and the ecosystems that most people picture when they think of African wildlife. In the north, the Sahara, and between those two worlds, a boundary so sharp in some places that you can draw a line across the map and say, on this side, life as we normally understand it. On that side, something else. That boundary is so familiar, so much a part of how the world looks, that it is easy to assume it has always been there, that Africa has always been divided this way, that the populations of sub-Saharan Africa and the populations of North Africa and the Middle East have always been separated by the distance that exists between them today. They have not. And understanding what the Green Sahara meant as a corridor, as a connective tissue between worlds that are now separated, requires sitting with a piece of evidence that most people have never encountered. It is not a dramatic piece of evidence. It is not a single discovery, or a single fossil, or a single grave. It is an animal, a living animal, one that exists today in a place where, by every logic of the modern world, it should not be able to exist at all. In the mountains of Mauritania, in the far western Sahara, there are crocodiles. Not fossils of crocodiles, not ancient bones preserved in sediment. Living crocodiles, Nile crocodile, surviving in the pools and caves of a mountain range called the Tagant Plateau, in one of the driest regions on Earth. They are small. These crocodiles, stunted by generations of scarce food and limited water, but they are real, and they are alive, and they are genetically distinct from any other crocodile population on the continent. They are isolated, completely isolated. The nearest crocodile population is thousands of kilometers away. In the rivers of sub-Saharan Africa, there is no river connecting the Tagant Plateau to those rivers. There is no route by which a crocodile could travel that distance through the modern Sahara and survive. The desert between Mauritania and the nearest permanent water to the south is an absolute barrier to a semi-aquatic reptile. So how did they get there? They did not travel through the modern Sahara. They traveled through a Sahara that no longer exists. Their ancestors were part of a continuous crocodile population that lived in the lakes and rivers of the Green Sahara, spread across the interior of North Africa in a network of water that made their distribution not only possible, but unremarkable. When the Green Sahara dried, the network of water fragmented. The crocodiles that had been living in what is now Mauritania found themselves cut off from the rest of their kind by a desert that grew up around them faster than they could migrate away from it. They have been isolated ever since, for thousands of years, slowly adapting to increasingly difficult conditions. Their population shrinking as the pools they depend on shrank, until they became what they are today, a remnant. A biological memory of a connection that no longer exists. The crocodiles of the Tagant Plateau are not just an interesting anomaly. They are living evidence. Physical, living, genetically verifiable evidence that the Green Sahara was not a story told by sediment cores and pollen samples alone. It was a real, connected landscape, real enough to sustain crocodile populations across what is now the Central Sahara. Real enough that the fragmentation of that landscape left survivors stranded in places where they have no business being alive. There is another piece of evidence for the Green Sahara's connectivity that most people never encounter. And it comes not from bones or pottery or genetic analysis, but from something alive and growing. In the mountains of the Central Sahara, in ranges like the Hogga in Algeria and the Tibesti in Chad, there are trees, not scrub, not the sparse, drought-adapted vegetation that manages to survive in the most inhospitable parts of the modern Sahara. Trees, cypress trees. To be specific, relict populations of a Mediterranean species that has no business being in the middle of the Sahara by any logic of the current climate. They survive in these mountain ranges because the elevation catches enough moisture to keep them alive, and they have been isolated in these mountain refugia long enough to have diverged genetically from their Mediterranean relatives. They got there the same way the crocodiles got to Mauritania, not through the modern desert, which would kill them, through the Green Sahara, when the landscape between the Mediterranean coast and the Saharan mountains was wet enough that a tree population could spread, slowly, generation by generation, across what is now an absolute barrier. The crocodiles are stranded in their pools. The trees are stranded on their mountains. Both of them are living evidence of a connection that no longer exists. Both of them are still there, maintaining their isolated existence in conditions that would not have produced them, because the conditions that did produce them are gone. The Green Sahara left survivors, and the survivors are still marking the places where it used to reach. What was true for crocodiles and cypress trees was true for other animals, and what was true for animals was true for people. Not in the same way. People are not crocodiles. People do not simply follow water and stop when the water stops. People make decisions. They plan. They maintain relationships across distances. They carry information about places they have never been, passed down through generations of oral tradition. A human community does not need a continuous corridor of water to maintain contact with other human communities. It needs the corridor to be passable, to offer enough resources along the way that movement through it does not cost more than it gains. The Green Sahara offered that. The evidence for this connectivity is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with a single discovery or a single site. It accumulates across different kinds of evidence pointing in the same direction. Pottery styles, from sites across the Green Sahara, share characteristics that are difficult to explain without contact between the communities that made them. Not identical pottery, related pottery. The kind of relationship between material traditions that develops when people are exchanging ideas rather than simply arriving at the same solutions independently. Stone tools show similar patterns. Raw materials found at one site sometimes came from sources hundreds of kilometers away, which means those materials were moving, which means people were moving, or goods were moving through networks of people who were moving, across distances that the modern geography makes look impossible, but that a connected landscape made routine. And beneath all of this, in ways the science is still working out, the genetic record suggests that the populations of the Green Sahara period were more connected to each other and to populations outside the Sahara than the modern desert would predict. Think about what this means, not in the language of archaeology, but in the language of a life. A family beside one of the paleo lakes in what is now central Libya could maintain contact with communities to their south, in the grasslands of what is now the Sahel, through a landscape of intermittent water sources and seasonal grazing grounds that made the journey difficult but not impossible. They could trade. They could intermarry. They could share the information about water and animals and routes that kept communities alive in a variable landscape. The Sahara today prevents that. It isolates. The Sahara of the Green period allowed it. It connected. And some of the genetic and cultural patterns visible across North Africa and neighboring regions today may carry traces of this opening and closing. Not as a single cause. The picture is far more complex than any single barrier can explain, but as one of the deep geographic forces that shaped who remained connected and who became separated. The Sahara did not create that divergence. The drying of the Sahara did. There is something worth staying with in that distinction. The diversity of the African continent, the extraordinary range of languages and cultures and physical characteristics that make Africa the most genetically diverse landmass on Earth, is not simply a product of the continent's size or its ancient habitation. It is also a product of the barriers that formed within it. The barriers that separated populations long enough for them to diverge, the barriers that turned neighbors into strangers and strangers into people who, thousands of years later, would look at each other across a desert and not recognize the family resemblance. One of those barriers was the Sahara, and the Sahara was not always a barrier. For a few thousand years, it was the opposite. It was the thing that held the connections together, the living tissue between worlds that are now, and have been for a very long time, apart. The door was open. People walked through it. And for as long as it was open, the map of human connection in North Africa looked nothing like the map we have inherited. No one knew it was ending. That is the first thing to understand about the death of the Green Sahara. It did not announce itself. There was no moment when the sky changed color, or the ground gave way, or some visible threshold was crossed that told the people living through it that the world they knew was not coming back. There was no catastrophe in the sense of a single event that could be pointed to and named. There was only the slow, accumulating weight of seasons that were slightly drier than the season before, of lakes that were slightly smaller at the end of each dry period than they had been the year before, of grasses that retreated a little further from the margins of the water each year and did not fully return when the rains came back. For any individual person living through the early stages of this process, the change was invisible. A lifetime is not long enough to see what a climate is doing. A generation is barely long enough. The baseline shifts, and the shift is not felt as a shift, but as the normal condition of the world. The lake is a little smaller than it was when your grandmother was young. The dry season is a little longer than it was in the stories your father told. But the lake is still there. The rains still come. The grass still grows. The cattle still find enough to eat. Go back to the orbital cycle. The same wobble that had pulled the monsoon north 11,000 years ago was now, slowly and without reversal, withdrawing its support. Summer solar radiation in the northern hemisphere was decreasing. The land was heating less intensely. The pressure gradient between the hot continent and the cooler Atlantic was weakening. The monsoon, which had been pulled so far north during the peak of the African humid period, began to retreat toward the south. This would have been enough, on its own, to dry the Sahara gradually over thousands of years. A slow, linear decline in rainfall corresponding to the slow, linear change in orbital forcing. But that is not what happened. What happened was something that climate scientists, when they first began modeling the end of the Green Sahara, found deeply puzzling. The models that assumed a smooth, gradual drying in response to orbital forcing did not match the evidence in the sediment cores. The evidence in the sediment cores showed something different. It showed a transition that was, in geological terms, abrupt, not instantaneous, not a single season or a single decade, but fast, much faster than the gradual orbital forcing alone would have produced. The reason for this is the feedback loop. Remember what built the Green Sahara. Rain fell, plants grew, plants held moisture, moisture generated more rain. The system amplified itself. Each element reinforced the others. The green world was not just a passive recipient of orbital forcing. It was an active participant in its own maintenance. Now run that process in reverse. As the monsoon began to retreat, rainfall decreased in the most vulnerable parts of the Sahara, typically the interior regions furthest from the Atlantic and furthest from the Sahel. With less rain, plants died. With fewer plants, the ground was exposed. Exposed ground reflects more sunlight than vegetated ground. More reflected sunlight means less heat absorbed by the surface. Less surface heat means a weaker pressure gradient. A weaker pressure gradient means less rain. Less rain means more plants die. The system that had amplified the greening now amplified the drying. The same feedback loop, running in the opposite direction, with the same compounding effect. And once the vegetation loss crossed a certain threshold, once enough ground was exposed to shift the regional energy balance significantly, the process became self-sustaining. It no longer needed the orbital forcing to continue. It was generating its own momentum. This is what a tipping point looks like from the inside of the climate record. Not a dramatic moment. Not a line you can point to and say, here is where it tipped. A region of the curve where the rate of change accelerates, where what had been a slow decline becomes something faster, where the system stops merely responding to external forcing and begins to drive itself. The Green Sahara did not fade. It collapsed. Not everywhere at once. That is important. The Sahara is not a uniform landscape, and the drying did not proceed uniformly across it. Different regions crossed their tipping points at different times. The interior dried first, then the margins. Some areas held on longer because of local geography, because a mountain range caught enough moisture to sustain vegetation beyond what the regional climate could support, because a deep aquifer continued to feed springs long after surface rainfall had failed, because the particular orientation of a valley or a plateau created a microclimate that delayed the inevitable. But for each community living in each of those regions, there came a specific point, a specific season, a specific year. Perhaps, though the people living through it would not have thought of it in those terms. A point at which the calculation changed, at which the question shifted from how do we manage through another dry year to whether we can continue to live here at all. Picture the community at Gobero. They had been living beside this lake for generations. The Tenerian pastoralists, the cattle herders of the later burial period, had come to this place because of the water. Their cattle needed it. Their community depended on it. They knew the lake the way you know a place you have lived beside all your life. Not as an abstraction, but as a specific, particular, named thing, with its own moods and rhythms and history. In the years of the early drying, the lake would have shrunk during the dry season more than it used to. It would have taken longer to recover during the rainy season. The grasses at the lake's margin were being grazed closer to the roots each year, because the area of productive grazing was contracting while the number of cattle that depended on it remained roughly the same. These are not abstractions. These are the specific pressures that pastoral communities face when the land is drying. They are the pressures that force decisions, not dramatic decisions, not the kind of decisions that feel like the end of a world, but the ordinary grinding decisions of people trying to keep their animals alive and their community fed in conditions that are becoming incrementally harder. At some point, the decision was made to leave. Or it was not made at all. Not as a single conscious choice, but as a series of smaller movements. A family that moved their herd a little further south one dry season and did not come back. Another family that followed the next year. A gradual dispersal that left the site empty, not because of any single event, but because each departure made the ones that followed more likely, until the community that had buried its dead beside this lake for generations was gone. The graves remained. The lake shrank further. Eventually it dried completely. The sand moved in. The bones sank deeper into the sediment as the surface was reworked by wind and occasional rain. And the place that had been a home, that had been a burying ground and a fishing ground and a source of water for cattle and a place where children learned the names of things and adults grew old and the dead were laid to rest with flowers, became what Paul Sereno's team found in the year 2000. Sand, bonus, silence. This is the pattern that repeated across the Green Sahara as the drying proceeded. Not a single catastrophe, but 1,000 smaller endings. Each community making its own version of the same calculation. Each lake offering a little less each year. Each dry season lasting a little longer. Each rainy season failing to fully restore what the dry season had taken. And the thing that makes this particular kind of ending so difficult to hold is that there was no enemy. There was no invasion. No disease. No volcanic eruption. No single event that could be named and mourned as the cause. There was only the slow withdrawal of the conditions that had made the world what it was. The sky giving less. The ground returning less. The system that had sustained everything gradually ceasing to sustain it. The orbital cycle that had opened the door did not slam it shut. It just stopped holding it open. And the door, left to itself, swung closed. By approximately 5,500 years ago, the Green Sahara, as a functioning, connected, life-supporting landscape was essentially gone. Not every trace of moisture had vanished. Oases persisted. Some mountain ranges retained enough elevation to catch occasional rain. Deep aquifers continued to feed isolated springs. The Sahara of 5,000 years ago was not quite the Sahara of today, but the world that had sustained the people of Gobero, the world that the painters of Tassili had recorded on their walls, the world that the crocodiles had spread across in their slow reptilian way, was gone. The corridor was closed. The connections it had maintained were severed. The people who had lived within it had to find somewhere else to be. And somewhere else, for most of them, meant somewhere that still had water. The rains did not return. Not that year, not the year after, not in the lifetime of anyone who had been alive when the last lake dried, not in the lifetime of their children. The baseline shifted one final time, and this time it did not shift back. When the water disappears, people do not disappear with it. That is the thing that gets lost in the way we talk about the end of the Green Sahara. The language of climate collapse, of ecosystem failure, of the death of a world, carries within it an implicit suggestion that the people who lived in that world died with it, that the ending of the Green Sahara was a human ending as well as an environmental one, that the communities of Gobero and Tassili and the paleo lakes of Libya and Mali simply ceased to exist when the conditions that had sustained them ceased to exist. They did not. People are not lake ecosystems. They do not require a specific set of conditions to function. They require water and food and each other. And when the particular configuration of water and food and landscape that has sustained them in one place stops providing those things, they look for somewhere else that does. They adapt. They move. They carry what they know into new landscapes and apply it there. They survive in conditions that would have been unrecognizable to their grandparents. Because survival is not about finding the perfect environment. It is about finding the next workable one. The people of the Green Sahara did not vanish when the Sahara dried. They moved. They dispersed. They followed the water as it retreated, tracking the edge of the viable world as it contracted, finding the places where the calculation still worked and staying there until it stopped working and then moving again. And where they went, and what happened when they got there, is one of the most consequential chapters in the deep history of the human species. But it is not a simple chapter. And the first thing to do, before any of the specific movements are described, is to resist the temptation to make it simple. The temptation is to draw an arrow on a map, to say the Sahara dried, and the people moved to the Nile. And therefore the civilization of ancient Egypt was born. Clean, causal, satisfying in the way that a single explanation for a complex phenomenon is always satisfying. It is not what happened, or not only what happened, or not in the direct, linear way that the arrow on the map would suggest. What actually happened was messier and more human than any arrow can capture. Different communities made different decisions. Different regions dried at different rates, which meant different communities faced the crisis at different times and with different resources. Some people moved south, into the Sahel, where the monsoon still reached and the grasses were still thick enough to support cattle. Some moved north, toward the Mediterranean coast, where the climate is moderated by the sea and rainfall is more reliable. Some moved east, along routes that had been established during the connected period of the Green Sahara, following the chain of communities that extended toward the Nile Valley and the Red Sea coast. Some stayed, contracting their range to the oases and mountain refugia that still held water, adapting from the pastoral abundance of the Green Sahara to a leaner, harder existence organized entirely around the few places where the water had not yet given up. None of these movements were migrations in the way the word is usually used. They were not organized. They were not led. They did not happen in a single generation or follow a single route. They were the aggregate of thousands of individual decisions, made by individual families and communities over centuries. Each decision, local and immediate, and driven by the specific pressure of a specific dry season in a specific place. But aggregate decisions, made by enough people over enough time, produce patterns. And the pattern that emerges from the archaeological and genetic evidence of this period is one of compression, of populations that had been spread across a vast landscape, gradually concentrating in the places where the landscape still provided. The Nile Valley was one of those places. The Nile is not fed by Saharan rainfall. It is fed by the Ethiopian highlands, by the monsoon system of East Africa, by sources entirely outside the drying system of the Central Sahara. While the paleolakes of Libya and Niger and Mali were shrinking and disappearing, the Nile continued to flow, while the grasslands of the interior were turning to sand. The narrow ribbon of fertility along the Nile's banks remained. The floodplain that the Nile's annual inundation replenished each year was not affected by the drying of the Sahara in the way that the Saharan interior was affected. The Nile was not created by the drying of the Sahara. It was not made more fertile by it. It was simply still there when everything around it was not. And that distinction between a place that is one of many options and a place that is one of very few options is the distinction that changes everything. During the Green Sahara, the Nile Valley was one corridor among several. A person living in what is now central Libya, deciding where to take their cattle in a dry year, had multiple options. The Paleolakes to the south, the Sahel corridor to the west, the Nile to the east. The choice was not forced. The landscape offered alternatives. As the alternatives disappeared, un, lake by lake, grassland corridor by grassland corridor, the Nile stopped being one option among several. It became, for an increasing number of people moving east across the drying landscape, the option, the place at the end of the calculation, the place where the water was. What happened at the Nile and in the other refugia where people concentrated as the Sahara dried is a longer story than this script can tell. What matters here is not the destination, but the compression. When a large number of people who have been living across a vast landscape are forced into a much smaller one, things change. The intensity of what happens in the places that still have water increases. The exchange of knowledge and tradition and technique that had been diffuse across the Green Sahara becomes concentrated. The pressure to organize, to manage shared resources, to develop the kinds of social structures that can handle density, increases with the density itself. The people who arrived at those refugia were not arriving empty-handed. They brought cattle. They brought ceramic traditions. They brought the accumulated knowledge of how to manage large-scale animal husbandry across variable landscapes, how to read the signs of seasonal water, how to negotiate the complex social arrangements that pastoral life requires. What those contributions produced, in the Nile Valley and elsewhere, is still being worked out. The archaeology and the genetics are still assembling the picture. But the compression happened, and the world that came after it carried something forward from the world that had ended. Go back to Gobero. The Tenerian pastoralists who buried their dead at Gobero in the period between 4,500 and 5,000 years ago were living in a world that was already fundamentally different from the world the Kiffian people had known. The lake they were living beside was a remnant, a fraction of the body of water that had supported the earlier community. The grasslands around it were contracting. The dry seasons were getting longer. The rains were becoming less reliable. They kept burying their dead there anyway. That is the detail that is hardest to explain and most worth sitting with. They were living in a dying landscape, and they kept returning to this specific place to bury their dead. They kept treating it as home, even as it was becoming less able to sustain them. Even as the lake shrank around them, and the grass retreated, and the animals that had made this place abundant moved on to wherever abundance had gone. Why? Because places are not just resources. They are not just configurations of water and grass that a rational calculator would abandon the moment a better configuration appeared elsewhere. Places are where you are from. They are the locations of your memories and your obligations and your dead. The graves at Gobero were not just graves. They were the reason to come back. The anchor that held a community to a specific piece of ground, even when the ground was giving less and less. The last people to bury their dead at Gobero were not holding on out of stubbornness or irrationality. They were holding on because leaving means more than changing location. It means leaving behind the place where your people are buried. It means abandoning the ground that your community has made sacred through generations of presence and loss. At some point, they left anyway. They had to. The lake dried completely. The grass was gone. The calculation that had always resolved in favor of staying finally resolved in favor of going. And they went. Where exactly they went, the archaeological record cannot tell us with precision. They dispersed into a landscape that was itself dispersing. Communities fragmenting and recombining as they followed the retreating water toward whatever had not yet dried. Some went south. Some went east. Some found their way to the Nile or to the Sahel or to the mountain refugia where a remnant of the old world survived a little longer. They carried their cattle. They carried their pottery. They carried their knowledge of water and grass and the rhythms of a variable landscape. They carried the memory of the lake they had left, of the graves they had left behind in the sand, of the world they had known and lost. They carried all of it into whatever came next, and whatever came next, for the people who survived the drying of the Green Sahara, was not the end of the human story in North Africa. It was a redirection, a narrowing of the possible routes, followed by a concentration of people and knowledge and tradition into the places that still had water. The door closed behind them, and they walked forward into a world that did not yet know what it was going to become. There is a sandstone cliff in the Algerian Sahara where the wind has been working on a painting for approximately 8,000 years. The painting shows a hippopotamus, not a stylized hippopotamus, not a symbol or an abstraction, but a hippopotamus rendered with the kind of attention that comes from looking at the real thing. The curve of the back, the heaviness of the body, the particular way the ears sit on the head. Someone stood in front of a real hippopotamus, in a real landscape, and looked at it long enough and carefully enough to carry the image back to this wall and press it into the stone with pigment and intention. The hippopotamus has been gone from this part of the world for thousands of years. The river it lived in has been gone just as long. The person who painted it has been gone so long that the concept of their individual existence is almost impossible to hold in the mind. And yet the painting remains. Faded. Yes, eroded at the edges by the same wind that has been reshaping the dunes below the cliff for millennia. But still there. Still recognizable. Still, if you stand in front of it and let your eyes adjust to the contrast between the pale stone and the darker pigment, still carrying something of the moment it was made. This is what remains of the Green Sahara, against the full scale of what existed. What remains is almost nothing, but almost nothing is not nothing. And what almost nothing can tell us, if we know how to read it, is more than the people who left it behind could have imagined when they were pressing pigment into stone or laying their dead in the ground beside a lake they expected to be there forever. Consider what has been found. At Wadi Mathendis in Libya, there are engravings of crocodiles carved into rock faces in a valley that now receives almost no rainfall. The crocodiles are large, rendered in detail, multiple individuals depicted at different scales. Someone spent significant time making these images. They required effort. They required the kind of sustained attention that people give to things that matter to them. Crocodiles mattered to these people, which means crocodiles were present, which means this valley had water, permanent or seasonal water, deep enough and reliable enough to support a population of large reptiles. At Wadi in Jiran, also in Algeria, there are images of elephants. At sites across the Fezzan region of Libya, there are paintings of cattle in styles that suggest multiple distinct artistic traditions, multiple communities with their own visual languages, all painting the same animals in the same landscape across overlapping centuries. At Gobero, under the sand of the Tenere, there are the bones of fish, not a few bones, not the casual remains of an occasional meal, but the accumulated evidence of a sustained fishing economy, people who ate fish regularly, who had techniques for catching them, who built their subsistence around a resource that required permanent water to exist, fish bones in the middle of the driest desert on earth. These things do not speak in the language of language. They do not tell stories with beginnings and middles and ends. They do not explain themselves. They require interpretation, and interpretation requires knowledge. And the knowledge required to read what the Sahara has preserved is still being assembled. New sites are discovered each year. New dating techniques refine the chronology. New methods of analysis extract information from materials that previous generations of researchers could not read. But there are things we cannot recover. And honesty about the limits of what we know is part of what it means to take the people of the Green Sahara seriously, as real people, rather than as characters in a story we are constructing for our own purposes. We do not know their languages. Not a single word. The languages spoken in the Green Sahara during the African humid period are gone as completely as the lakes that were there when those languages were spoken. We can speculate about relationships to modern African language families. And linguists have attempted to reconstruct elements of proto-languages that might have been ancestral to modern languages spoken in the regions bordering the Sahara. but the specific languages of the people who painted the walls of Tassili, who buried their dead at Gobaro, who herded their cattle across the grasslands of what is now central Libya, are irrecoverable. They exist in no dictionary and no grammar and no fragment of preserved text. Because there was no text, there was no writing. We do not know their names for things. Not the name for the lake at Gobaro. Not the name for the hippopotamus in the painting. Not the word they used for the particular quality of light on the water in the early morning, or for the sound the cattle made at dusk when they were being brought in for the night, or for the feeling of the first rain after a long dry season. We do not know what they believed happened after death. The flowers placed over the triple burial at Gobaro tell us that the moment of death was treated as significant, that it required a response, that the people who stood over those bodies felt something that needed to be expressed through action. But what the flowers meant in their specific tradition, whether they were an offering or simply the most beautiful thing that could be placed in a grave, whether the arrangement of the bodies was prescribed by ritual or chosen in the moment by someone trying to do the most loving thing they could think of. We do not know. We do not know most of what there is to know about the people of the Green Sahara. What we know is the shape of the outline, the broad dimensions of a world that existed, the evidence that people lived in it fully and completely, not as primitives enduring a harsh existence, but as communities with their own complexity and their own beauty and their own ways of being human in the specific place and time they inhabited. And in recent years, science has begun to add one more layer to what can be recovered, carefully and incompletely, from what remains. The ancient DNA work being done on skeletal material from Green Sahara sites is in its early stages. The samples are few. The preservation is variable. The methods for analyzing ancient genetic material from hot, dry environments are still being refined. Any specific claim made on the basis of current ancient DNA evidence from the Sahara needs to be held lightly, as a provisional finding subject to revision as more data becomes available. But what the early work suggests is this: the people of the Green Sahara were not a single population. They were not genetically homogeneous. Different sites show different genetic profiles, which is consistent with a landscape that supported multiple communities with distinct histories, trading and interacting with each other across the connected world of the African humid period, but maintaining their own identities and their own lineages. Some of those lineages appear to connect to modern populations in the regions bordering the Sahara, in ways that suggest the people of the Green Sahara did not simply disappear when their world dried. They contributed. Their genetic material, their traditions, their knowledge, moved into the populations that survived in the refugia and the river valleys and the coastal zones where the water lasted. They are still there. In other words, not as a population, not as a culture, but as a contribution, as part of the inheritance of the people who live today in the regions that border the Sahara, carried forward in ways that are only now beginning to be legible to the tools of modern science. The sand covered the lakes. The sand covered the rivers. The sand covered the graves and the hearths and the places where communities gathered and the paths that people walked between one waterhole and the next. But the sand did not cover everything. On the walls of Tassili, the hippopotamus is still there, faded and eroded and requiring effort to see, but there, still carrying, in its carefully observed curves and its patient attention to the reality of the animal that the painter stood in front of, something of the world that made it, not a message. Exactly. The painter was not trying to send a message to the future. They were not thinking about the future in any way that included us. They were doing what people do when they live somewhere and pay attention to it. They were marking the fact of what was there. And what was there? The hippopotamus in the river in the grassland in the place that is now a desert, was real. It was real. And the fact that it is gone does not make it less real. It makes it more necessary to remember. Because a world that was real and is now gone was not a dream or a myth or a speculation. It was a place where people lived, and animals moved, and water ran, and children learned the names of things. It was, for the people who were there, simply the world, and they left us just enough to know that it existed. Go back to Gobero, not to the science of it, not to the burial phases, or the paleoclimate data, or the genetic profiles of the populations that lived and died beside that lake. Go back to the place itself, to the sand and the silence and the pale expanse of dried lake bed that Paul Sereno's team crossed in the year 2000, not looking for what they found, not prepared for what the desert had been keeping for thousands of years beneath its surface. Go back to the moment before they understood what they were looking at. There is a particular quality to that kind of moment. The moment before recognition, when the evidence is present, but the meaning has not yet assembled itself into something the mind can hold. Sereno's team saw bones in the sand. Bones are not unusual in a desert. The Sahara is full of bones. Animals die there. Things that were once alive end up as mineral in the substrate of a landscape that preserves the hard parts of things long after everything else has gone. And then the bones kept coming. And then the graves became visible. And then the scale of what they were standing in the middle of began to resolve into something that had no precedent in their experience of this landscape. A cemetery, in the middle of the Tenere, in one of the most inhospitable places on earth. Someone had been here, many someones, across many generations, coming back to this specific place, this specific patch of ground, to bury their dead, treating it as the kind of place that deserves to hold the people you have lost, the kind of place that is worth returning to, even when returning is difficult, even when the landscape around it is becoming less and less willing to sustain you, the kind of place that is home. Sereno has returned to Gobero many times since 2000. Each field season adds something, a new burial, a new analysis, a new piece of the picture that the desert has been keeping under the sand for thousands of years. He has said, in interviews, that Gobero changed what he understood his work to be, that before Gobero, he thought of archaeology as recovery, finding the past, documenting it, bringing it forward into the present where it could be understood. After Gobero, he began to think of it differently, not as recovery but as listening. The ground has been talking for thousands of years. We are only now, with the tools we have and the questions we know how to ask, beginning to hear what it is saying. That word, listening, is the right word for what this entire story has required. Listening to the sediment cores and the pollen records and the fossil bones, listening to the painted walls of Tassili, to the careful arrangement of arms in a grave, to the chemical trace of flowers in the sediment of a burial that was closed thousands of years ago and not opened again until a team of scientists stumbled across it while looking for something else entirely. Listening to the crocodiles still living in their isolated pools in Mauritania, and to the cypress trees still standing on their mountain refugia in Algeria and Chad, both of them stranded survivors of a connection that ended long before any living person was born, still marking with their presence the places where the green Sahara used to reach. This is what the Sahara has been doing beneath its surface, while the world above it forgot that anything had ever been there. Keeping. The sand keeps poorly, but it keeps something. The rock keeps better. The sediment keeps best of all. holding in its layers a record of every season that passed over it, every rain that fell into it, every body that was placed inside it with care. The ground keeps what the surface erases. And because it keeps, we can know things that should by rights be unknowable. We can know that a woman and 2 children were buried together in the Tenere thousands of years ago with flowers placed over them. We can know that the person who arranged their arms into that final position was standing in a landscape full enough of life to produce flowers worth cutting. We can know that the world those flowers came from was real, that it had lakes and rivers and cattle and painted walls and communities that returned to the same ground across a gap of 1,000 years, because the ground held something worth returning to. We can know that the Sahara was not always the Sahara. That is not a small thing to know. Most of the past is gone without trace. Most of the people who have ever lived left nothing behind. The vast majority of human experience, of human love and loss and knowledge and beauty, has vanished as completely as the water in the lakes of the Green Sahara, leaving no record that can be read by any instrument we have or will have. The default condition of the past is silence. Gobero is an exception. Tassili is an exception. The crocodiles of Mauritania and the cypress trees of the Hogga Mountains are exceptions. The sediment cores and the pollen records and the ancient DNA are exceptions. Each one of them is a place where the silence broke, where the record survived long enough to be found, where the ground kept something the surface was trying to erase. She knew the lake. She knew the grass and the cattle and the particular way the light fell on the water in the early morning. She knew the people around her, the ones whose names we will never know, the ones whose language we will never speak, the ones whose understanding of the world she shared completely and whose absence, at the end, required flowers. She was home, en Paul Sereno, standing in the sand of the Tenere in the year 2000, not looking for what he found, was the first person in thousands of years to know that she had been there. That is what the ground kept. Not the lake, not the grass, not the language or the cattle or the knowledge of which waterholes were reliable in a dry year. Those are gone. What the ground kept was the shape of 3 people arranged in the sand with flowers placed over them, and the chemical trace of those flowers in the sediment, and the position of arms reaching toward each other across the dark. The desert is not empty. It is full of what it could not erase. The door opened thousands of years ago. It stayed open long enough for people to build lives inside it, to raise children and bury parents and paint the animals they loved on the walls of shelters that are still standing. It stayed open long enough for the corridor it created to shape the movement of people and animals and knowledge across a continent. And then it closed, slowly and without announcement, the way all the most consequential things end. Not with a single moment, but with the accumulation of many small ones, until the last one comes and there is nothing left to lose. The people who were standing in it when it closed walked forward into whatever came next. They did not know what that would be. None of us ever do. What they carried with them, the knowledge and the cattle and the ceramic traditions and the memory of the lake and the graves beside it, became part of the world that came after them, a world that does not remember them, a world that looks at the Sahara and sees emptiness rather than the outline of everything that emptiness replaced. But the map beneath the sand is still legible, and we are only just learning how to read it.